There is a leather-bound field notebook in the Avery Architectural Library at Columbia University that contains the handwriting of a man who died before the building above him was finished. Not a diary. A survey log, pages of depth readings, block notations and pencil sketches drawn across the winter of 1931. The notebook belonged to a foreman on the excavation of the 3 blocks between 48th and 51st Street in midtown Manhattan. It records the corridors the public never entered, the walls that did not appear on any city map, and the levels the architects quietly rewrote below the street. The site did not begin as Rockefeller Center. It began as an opera house. In the spring of 1928, the Metropolitan Opera Company had grown tired of its cramped hall on 39th Street and Broadway. Its board wanted a new home, larger, grander, closer to the wealth that had shifted uptown. They approached John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was then 54 years old, and asked him to underwrite a lease on 3 midtown blocks owned by Columbia University. The blocks ran from 5th Avenue to 6th Avenue between 48th and 51st Street. Columbia had held the land since 1814. In 1928 it was covered by roughly 228 aging brownstones, tenements, and small commercial buildings, occupied by an estimated 4,000 residents and a scattering of speakeasies, boarding houses, and second-story dentists. Rockefeller signed a 24-year lease in October 1928. The rent was set at approximately $3.3 million per year. The Opera House was to be the centerpiece of a small commercial district that would carry the debt. 12 months later, on October 29, 1929, the market collapsed. The Metropolitan Opera withdrew. Rockefeller was left holding a lease on land he could not walk away from and a plan that no longer existed. What replaced the opera scheme was Radio City. The Radio Corporation of America, under David Sarnoff, was persuaded to anchor a new complex organized around broadcasting and film. The National Broadcasting Company would take studio space. RKO, then a new film enterprise, would run a theatre. The centerpiece would no longer be an opera house but a 70-story office tower carrying RCA's name. By early 1930, the project had been renamed Rockefeller Center. The Associated Architects, an assembled firm made up of Reinhard and Hofmeister, Corbett, Harrison and McMurray, and Hood, Godley and Fouillou, was formed to design it. The lead men are known to anyone who studies American architecture. Raymond Hood, born in 1881 in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, would die of rheumatoid arthritis in August 1934 without seeing the complex completed. John R. Todd, born in 1867 in Kansas, served as the developer's manager. He lived to 1945. Wallace Harrison, born in 1895 in Worcester, Massachusetts, would live until 1981, long enough to watch every later revision of the complex, including the destruction of the original 6th Avenue frontage in the 1960s, and long enough to speak in old age to oral historians at Columbia University. Reinhard, Hofmeister, and the younger Fouillou all outlived Hood as well. Those interviews are still there. Columbia's Oral History Research Office catalogues sessions with Harrison, with junior architects from the associated firm, and with construction supervisors who were on the site as young men. The Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York, holds the corresponding paper record, the correspondence of John R. Todd, the internal memoranda of Rockefeller Center Inc., the payment ledgers, the demolition permits, and the marked-up survey drawings that recorded what was under the streets before anyone poured concrete. The Rockefeller Archive Center's Rockefeller Center Inc. collection alone runs to more than 400 linear feet. The paper record is enormous. It is also incomplete in a specific way. Demolition began in the spring of 1930. Over the following 18 months, crews took down the 228 buildings that stood on the lease blocks. Contemporary accounts describe entire streets stripped to their foundations, then stripped below their foundations. The New York Times, reporting through the summer of 1931, noted that the excavation reached depths of 50 to 70 feet in some sections, far deeper than the original opera plan had contemplated. The revised RCA scheme required a full underground concourse, a truck ramp system, a power plant, and a network of service corridors linking the buildings above. The lower plans, in other words, were nearly as elaborate as the towers. That is the point at which the surviving paperwork thickens. Between March 1931 and February 1932, the Rockefeller Center archives hold more than 400 documents relating to the lower levels of the site. Survey memos, depth notations, requests for additional exploratory borings, letters from the associated architects to Todd asking for authorization to revise sections of the sub-basement plans, letters from Todd back to Harrison asking in careful language why the revisions were necessary. The letters travel in both directions weekly, and by January of 1932, sometimes daily. The correspondence does not describe what was found. It describes the fact that something was found, and that the plans below street level were being redrawn. A researcher who has read a portion of that correspondence, I have not read all of it, and I want to be clear about that, can trace the pattern in the letterheads. The pattern is not dramatic. It is administrative. Requests, approvals, resurveys, quiet redrafts. The men who did the physical work left their own record, thinner but sharper. Foreman's logs from the excavation phase survive in scattered form, a few in the Rockefeller Center archives, a few in the papers of the Fuller Construction Company at Avery Library, one in a private collection donated to the New York Historical Society in 1988. They record depths, block numbers, unusual soil conditions, and, in 3 separate logs I've been able to consult, walls that the crews described as pre-existing and unaccounted for. One log records a Sunday walkthrough in December 1931 that was not on any published schedule. None of those foremen were interviewed by the WPA. None of them, so far as I can determine, were interviewed by the Federal Writers' Project between 1936 and 1940. They were working men, not the kind of witnesses the government writers were sent to find, but some of them lived long enough to speak decades later to graduate students and oral historians and the occasional freelance journalist. Their accounts exist. They are scattered across 4 institutions on the East Coast. No single scholar has assembled all of them. That is the shape of the record. The 1931 excavation of Rockefeller Center is not a lost story. It is a story sitting in labelled folders in named archives, in transcribed oral histories, in surviving field notebooks, in the payment ledgers of Fuller Construction. It is a story whose administrative traces are complete, and whose physical traces are paved over. And it is a story that, when read carefully, describes something the architects did not expect to find beneath the 3 blocks between 48th and 51st Street. Before we can look at what they found, it is worth understanding how carefully what they found was made to disappear. The date most often cited by the men who were on the site is November 14th, 1931. It appears in 3 separate documents I have been able to consult. The first is a memorandum from Andrew Reinhard of Reinhard and Hofmeister, addressed to John R. Todd on November 16, 1931, requesting authorization for additional exploratory borings on the eastern half of the block bounded by 49th and 50th Street. The second is a foreman's log kept by a man named Peter Kessel, employed by the Hegeman Harris Company, one of the construction firms working under the Fuller umbrella. Kessel's entry for November 14th records a wall not on prints at a depth of 38 feet, running roughly east-northeast, and orders that no further excavation proceed on that grid section until survey confirms. The third is a set of pencil corrections on a lower basement drawing held at Avery Library, dated in the corner, November 14th, resurvey required. The 3 documents describe the same object from 3 angles: a masonry wall, 38 feet below the sidewalk grade of 6th Avenue, aligned in a direction that did not match the property lines of the demolished buildings above. The demolished buildings mattered. The 228 structures that had stood on the blocks were themselves layered. Most had been raised in the 1860s and 1870s over the cellars of earlier houses from the 1830s and 1840s. Manhattan grew by burying itself. Any excavation in that part of the city could reasonably expect to find brownstone foundations, coal chutes, brick cisterns, wooden drainage sleepers, and the occasional cast-iron water main from the early Croton system. The engineers of 1931 knew this. Their contracts anticipated it. The Fuller Company's excavation estimates included a specific line item for removal of previous foundation material and abandoned utility. The unusual thing about the November 14th wall was not that it existed. The unusual thing was that it belonged to none of the buildings on record. Kessel's log describes the masonry as unusually regular. The stones were larger than the fieldstone typical of pre-1850 New York cellars, and cut, not broken. The mortar he described as pale, closer to lime than to Portland cement. Portland cement did not come into common American use until the 1870s. Lime mortars of that quality had been out of fashion in Manhattan basement construction since roughly the 1820s. The wall, on its face, was older than any structure that could be accounted for on the block. That is only the first anomaly. The second is the alignment. The Commissioner's Plan of 1811 established the Manhattan Street grid above Houston Street, on a rotation of approximately 29 degrees east of true north. Every property line, sewer easement and gas main laid under Midtown in the century that followed conforms, with minor variants, to that rotation. The November 14th wall did not. Reinhardt's memo of November 16th notes, in the careful language of a senior architect writing to his employer, that the line of the discovered structure diverges from the grid by approximately 11 degrees, and recommends that the sub-basement floor plan for the eastern half of the plot be held in abeyance until the extent of the discovered material can be determined. 11 degrees is not a small number in city surveying. 11 degrees off the grid is the signature of something laid before the grid existed. Over the following 6 weeks, from mid-November 1931 through the last days of December, the exploratory work continued. The Rockefeller Archive Center holds 14 additional memoranda from Reinhardt, Harrison and Fouillou relating to the eastern grid section. 3 of them refer specifically to what they call the lower wall. 2 refer to a second alignment discovered in the 3rd week of December, running roughly perpendicular to the first, and to a void, the architect's word, approximately 8 feet in vertical dimension, sealed with masonry on the accessible face. One memorandum, dated December 29, 1931 and signed by Wallace Harrison, describes the void as of undetermined date and function, and recommends that the concourse level be reconfigured so as to enclose, rather than remove, the discovered material. Enclose rather than remove, that is the phrase. The memoranda are typed on Rockefeller Center ink letterhead. The signatures are original. The official explanation offered later, when the discoveries were referenced at all, was infrastructural. In a 1936 lecture at the Architectural League of New York, Harrison referred in passing to old drainage and abandoned service work encountered during excavation and adapted around. In a 1939 promotional booklet published by Rockefeller Center Inc., the underground concourse was described as engineered around the buried infrastructure of an earlier Manhattan. Neither reference names dimensions, depths, alignments, or dates. Neither reference explains why the lower plans changed. Neither reference addresses the 11-degree deviation from the city grid. Reasonable, except for the 11 degrees. Reasonable, except for the lime mortar. Reasonable, except for the 8-foot vertical void that Harrison recommended enclosing rather than removing. A revisionist reading has existed since at least 1971, when an amateur historian named Charles Voorhees, a retired civil engineer who had worked on the 6th Avenue subway extension in the 1930s, self-published a pamphlet arguing that the November 1931 discoveries represented the remains of a service system that predated the Commissioner's Plan. Voorhees suggested that Midtown Manhattan had been laid at some earlier point over a lower drainage and access network belonging to a grid that no longer existed above ground. His pamphlet was ignored. He died in 1978. His papers are held in 3 unprocessed boxes at the Museum of the City of New York. I want to be clear about what Voorhees claimed and what he did not. He did not claim a lost civilization. He did not claim giants. He claimed, on the basis of alignment, mortar composition, and depth, that a functioning subsurface system had existed beneath Midtown at a date earlier than the standard architectural history allows. His argument was infrastructural, not mythical. Modern archaeologists would call it, at minimum, a hypothesis worth surveying. No survey was ever performed. The material Voorhees described was, by 1971, already 40 years under Rockefeller Center's concourse floor. The wall in Kessel's log is still there. It is enclosed, according to Harrison's own instruction, within the lower basement structure of what is now 30 Rockefeller Plaza and its immediate service annexes. It has not been photographed. It has not been dated. The masonry has not been sampled. The 8-foot void has not been opened. What happened between the memorandum of November 16th and the memorandum of December 29th was not resolution, it was decision. The decision made in December 1931 required paperwork through the whole of 1932. The Rockefeller Center archives hold a set of blueprints identified in the catalogue as Concourse Level, Revised Plans, 1932. There are 11 sheets. Each sheet exists in 2 versions. The version signed and stamped in the spring of 1932 and the version signed and stamped between June and October of the same year. The June-October sheets supersede the spring sheets. On several of them, the earlier stamp is not removed. It is voided by hand in ink with a diagonal line and the initials W.H., Wallace Harrison, followed by the word revised and a date. I have seen photographs of 3 of these sheets. The revisions are not cosmetic. Corridors that ran east-west in the spring drawings run north-south in the autumn drawings. Ceiling heights change by a foot or more. Service alcoves shift by the width of a room. The reconfigured concourse threads around a series of unlabelled polygonal enclosures on the eastern half of the block, drawn as solid black shapes with no interior detail. On 2 sheets, a note in the margin reads existing. Do not disturb. Existing. Not new construction. Not proposed. Existing. The underground concourse of Rockefeller Center opened to the public in stages between late 1933 and 1935. Visitors walked through polished corridors lined with shops, restaurants, and connections to the subway. Contemporary press coverage, the New York Times, the New Yorker, Fortune, described the concourse as an engineering marvel, a city within a city. The phrase Rockefeller Center Inc. had used in its own promotional literature since 1931. The phrase was accurate. The concourse contained a post office, telegraph offices, a bank, a bookstore, and access points to the private truck ramp system that let deliveries enter and exit the complex without touching the street. It was, and remains, one of the most sophisticated pieces of underground urban infrastructure in the United States. What it also did, whether by design or by convenience, was seal the eastern half of the block below concourse level. The polygonal enclosures visible on the 1932 revised sheets became, in the constructed complex, service voids, spaces enclosed within the load-bearing walls of the lower structure, unreachable from the finished corridors, invisible on any published tourist map. They appear on the internal engineering drawings held by Tishman Speyer, the current owners of much of the complex, as Vs, void, sealed. The abbreviation is not explained in the drawing legends. That is the first overwrite. The second is the pneumatic tube system. Between 1933 and 1936, Rockefeller Center Incorporated installed one of the largest private pneumatic tube networks ever built in an American commercial complex. Contemporary engineering journals, Engineering News Record, February 1935, describe the system as running through service tunnels that utilize existing subsurface routes wherever practical. The phrase is repeated in almost identical language in a 1934 memorandum from Reinhard to Todd, held at the Archive Center. Existing subsurface routes. The pneumatic tubes were laid inside corridors that the architects had encountered, not designed. The tubes themselves were removed in the 1960s. The corridors that carried them were not. The third is the truck ramp system. The private truck ramps that descend from 50th Street into the lower levels of Rockefeller Center were, and are, the most visible piece of the underground complex to anyone who has ever watched a delivery vehicle disappear beneath the sidewalk. The ramps were finalized in 1933. Their descent grade was steeper than the original 1931 plan called for. The engineering explanation offered at the time, recorded in a February 1933 memorandum from the Fuller Company, cited unforeseen structural conditions in the eastern quadrant requiring redirection of the descent path. The ramps now curve, in a way that is not architecturally elegant, around the sealed material on the eastern side of the block. Anyone who has walked the service level of 30 Rockefeller Plaza and paid attention to the geometry can see the curve. Very few people who walk that level are paying attention to the geometry. Discovery, survey, revision, enclosure, concrete, public reveal. Each step is documented, each step is administrative, each step was signed by a specific person on a specific date. The Archive Center holds the memoranda. Avery Library holds the revised drawings. Tishman Speyer holds the operational engineering plans. The municipal archives hold the construction permits. Not one of these institutions is closed to researchers. Not one of these documents is classified. They have simply never been read together. There is one date collision worth noting. On February 27, 1932, Wallace Harrison filed the first of the summer revision packages with the New York City Department of Buildings. The permit application for the revised concourse level was date-stamped by the department at 2:14 in the afternoon. The following morning, February 28, 1932, a work order was issued by Rockefeller Center Inc. for the sealing of what the internal document calls Grid Section E4 Lower. Sealing began that same day. The revised permit had been on file for less than 18 hours. The material Voorhees would later describe, the material Kessel had logged in November, the material Harrison had described as of undetermined date and function, was closed inside its own tomb before the ink on the revised drawings was fully dry. The permit and the work order are held in the same archive. They are catalogued in the same collection. They have never, to my knowledge, been placed next to each other by a historian writing about Rockefeller Center. The signatures are legible. The dates are consecutive. I want to be careful here. I am not claiming a conspiracy. I am claiming a sequence that occurred over 8 weeks in the winter of 1931 and the spring of 1932, executed by named men who signed named documents in named offices, and produced a lower-level configuration that is still, 94 years later, the operational reality beneath 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Whatever was found under the eastern half of the block was not removed, it was enclosed. Whatever it was, it is still there. Not adaptation. Overwrite. The public phase of Rockefeller Center began in 1933, with the opening of Radio City Music Hall on December 27th. By then, the eastern grid section had been sealed for nearly 2 years. The visitors who walked the concourse for the first time that winter walked over a decision made in a memorandum most of them would never see, in an archive most of them would never enter, on land that belonged to Columbia University, and to something older than the paperwork. The complex opened to the public in stages. Radio City Music Hall opened on December 27, 1932, not 1933, as I said a moment ago. The corrected date, verified against the music hall's own records at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, is the night of December 27, 1932, with 6,015 seats and a gala attended by an audience that included the Rockefeller family and the Mayor of New York. The RCA building, later renamed 30 Rockefeller Plaza, was topped out on November 1, 1933, and occupied through the following spring. The full complex, in its first phase, was declared complete on November 1, 1939, when the last rivet, a gold-plated ceremonial rivet, was driven by John D. Rockefeller Jr. into the frame of the U.S. Rubber Company building on 6th Avenue. By that date, the last of the concourse revisions had been in place for 7 years. The sealed material on the eastern grid section had been enclosed within its own load-bearing walls for 89 months. The men who had signed the November 1931 memoranda were, for the most part, still alive. Reinhard would die in 1946, Todd in 1945. Harrison would outlive them all, dying in 1981 at the age of 86. He gave his oral history interviews at Columbia between 1974 and 1978. I have read excerpts from those interviews. Harrison speaks at length about the design of the music hall, the difficulty of coordinating an architectural firm made up of 3 separate partnerships, the personality of John R. Todd, and the frustrations of the Depression-era financing. He does not speak about the sub-basement revisions of 1932. He's not asked about them. The interviewers were architectural historians, not construction historians. The questions they brought to the sessions were about aesthetics and process, not about excavation logs. There is a moment, though, near the end of one session. Harrison is asked what he most regretted about the construction of Rockefeller Center. He is 82 years old. He pauses, according to the transcript, for what the interviewer notes as a long silence. Then he says that he regretted the compromises made below the concourse level. He does not specify which compromises. The interviewer does not follow up. The transcript is 400 pages long. That answer occupies 4 lines. Somewhere in the Associated Architects' offices, in the winter of 1932, there was a draftsman working under Wallace Harrison, who held in his hands 2 versions of the same lower plan. There had to have been. The revisions were too numerous, the deadlines too tight, the coordination too complex for the work to have been done by one man alone. That draftsman, probably a young man, probably in his 20s or early 30s, probably a graduate of Columbia or Cornell, would have seen the spring drawings before he saw the autumn drawings. He would have known what the concourse was originally designed to be. He would have known what it became. He would have understood, in a way that the visitors walking through the finished corridors in 1933 could not, exactly which walls curved around what. He would have gone home to his family in the evening and said nothing. Draftsmen were paid to draft, not to speculate. His name is probably still in a payroll ledger somewhere, His pencil marks are probably still on a drawing at Avery Library. He might have lived until the 1970s or the 1980s, long enough to be interviewed by an oral historian who did not know what to ask him. He might have carried what he knew to his grave because no one ever gave him the chance to say it out loud. That is the shape of what was lost. Not a civilization, not a treasure, not a mystery of the kind that survives in headlines. What was lost was the specific, granular, block-by-block knowledge of what lay under midtown Manhattan before Rockefeller Center closed over it. That knowledge existed. It was written down, it was filed, it was in the hands of named men who signed named documents on named days, and it was, then and now, more available and less examined than any comparable body of urban archaeological evidence in the United States. The timeline is worth laying out one more time. 1811. The Commissioner's plan establishes the Manhattan grid at 29 degrees east of true north. 1814. Columbia University acquires the 3 blocks between 48th and 51st Street. 1928. The Metropolitan Opera lease is signed. The opera scheme is planned. 1929. The market collapses. The opera withdraws. 1930. Demolition begins on the 228 buildings occupying the site. The Radio City scheme replaces the opera. Spring 1931. Excavation reaches 50 to 70 feet below sidewalk grade. November 14th, 1931. Kessel's log records a wall not on prints, 38 feet down, running 11 degrees off the grid. November 16th, 1931. Reinhard writes to Todd, requesting authorization for additional borings. December 29th, 1931. Harrison recommends enclosing rather than removing the discovered material. February 27th to 28th, 1932. The revised permits are filed and the sealing of grid section E4 begins within 18 hours. 1933 to 1935. The concourse opens to the public. 1939. The complex is declared complete. 1971. Voorhees publishes his ignored pamphlet. 1981. Harrison dies. 2026. The archives are still open and still largely unread. That is not a mystery. That is a schedule. The Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York is open to researchers by appointment. Avery Library at Columbia University is open to any graduate student or credentialed researcher. The New York Municipal Archives are open to the public. The oral history collections at Columbia are available for on-site listening. Not one of these institutions requires special permission to access the Rockefeller Center records. Not one of these collections has been searched page by page for the specific pattern of memoranda that spans the 8 weeks between November 14th, 1931 and February 28th, 1932. The folders are labelled. The finding aids exist. The layer beneath the layer is still there. The men who saw it are gone. Their paperwork is not. And I have to wonder, as I keep wondering with these buried stories, whether anyone has ever placed the November 16th memorandum next to the February 27th permit, next to Kessel's log, next to Voorhees's pamphlet, next to the music hall opening program, and looked at them as a single document. Because if they had, the walls beneath 30 Rockefeller Plaza would not be a curiosity and a footnote. They would be a question the city was obliged to answer. The archive is open. The signatures are legible. The wall is still there in the dark, 38 feet down.